Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. The Iowa History 101 webinars share the Iowa stories and history of the state through a cultural lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will learn more about how American Indians in the Midwest resisted the United States and its project of settler colonialism in the 19th century. Historians over the last 3 decades have increasingly come to understand that American Indians developed several strategies to retain their homelands, strategies that range from overt forms of resistance, such as warfare, to anonymous forms of resistance as well. We acknowledge the Indigenous people that have called Iowa home since time immemorial, as well as the more than 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. We acknowledge that the land now known as the state of Iowa was the ancestral home of the Iowa Nation, and our state is named in recognition of them. Iowa was also an ancestral home at times for the Oto-Missouri, Meskwaki, Sauk, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Omaha-Ponca, and Potawatomi, as well as other tribes that passed through at various times. The language used to identify many of our lakes, rivers, cities, counties, schools, buildings, and sites reflects the inherent imprint of Indigenous peoples. We offer our respect to their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have made essential contributions to the landscape of Iowa, including traditional knowledge, experience, labor, technology, science, philosophy, and the arts. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Patrick Jung. Patrick earned his doctoral degree in United States history from Marquette University in 1997 and has taught history and cultural anthropology at the Milwaukee School of Engineering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin since 2003. He has researched and written extensively on Indian-white relations in the regions of the Upper Great Lakes and the Upper Mississippi Valley. Dr. Jung is particularly interested in various strategies that Native people employed to resist the political and cultural colonialism of the United States. His recent article in the Annals of Iowa examines Native resistance in the Western Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley, and he is currently planning a book-length manuscript on this topic. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Patrick to begin the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would just like to acknowledge a few people. First of all, I'd like to thank Jennifer for helping to set this up. As she mentioned, this talk is largely based upon an article that will appear very shortly in the Annals of Iowa, the historical journal of the State Historical Society of Iowa. And I particularly want to thank the editor, Andrew Klump, who is probably one of the best editors I've ever worked with. And I think the Annals of Iowa is not only the premier journal for the state of Iowa, it is by far one of the most, top-notch scholarly journals on Midwestern history. And the Iowa State Historical Society, I think, has a real gem with the Annals of Iowa. And for those of you who'd like to read the full-length article, I would encourage you to join the State Historical Society of Iowa and receive the annals on a quarterly basis. Let me talk a little bit about the title of my talk, American Indian Resistance to Settler Colonialism in the Midwest. This is a topic that I have studied since I was in graduate school back in the 1990s. And so this has been almost a 30-year intellectual journey. And this article that will be coming out shortly is sort of the culmination of that in many ways. I could probably have written this article earlier. And in many ways, I'm glad I did not, because the last 2 decades, particularly the last decade, there have been new historical concepts, anthropological concepts, interpretations, frameworks that have really reshaped our understanding of Indian-white relations, not just in the Western Great Lakes and the Upper Mississippi Valley, but in North America. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those things today. I think this is a particularly fertile time for historians and cultural anthropologists to really dig into the history of Indian-white relations, particularly in the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Upper Mississippi Valley. So let me talk about some of the work that's been done. And again, I always like to stress that when a historian like myself or any scholar publishes something, it's rarely the case where that person has just out of the blue developed, some radically new idea on their own. They build upon the work of scholars who came before them, and that was certainly the case with me. And I think it's really important to acknowledge those scholars. First of all, the idea of settler colonialism, I should probably explain that a little bit. That has been a historical and interpretive framework that has really taken the historical profession by storm in the last few decades, particularly the last decade. The idea of settler colonialism was developed by an Australian anthropologist, Patrick Wolfe. And of course, when we look at the history of Australia, there are many parallels to the history of North America, with the relations between incoming European settlers and the Aboriginal people of Australia. And Wolfe has influenced many American scholars, in particular Nancy Shoemaker of the University of Connecticut. She's done quite a bit to promulgate Patrick Wolfe's work. I cite Nancy Shoemaker's work in my article. Another scholar who's been influenced by Wolfe is Michael Witkin. I cite his work as well. I think they've done the most to take a lot of Wolfe's ideas and put them into a North American context. And definitely, if I expand this into a book-length manuscript, it's something I definitely want to develop even further, the idea of settler colonialism. Well, one of the ideas that Patrick Wolfe examines in his work is the idea of elimination. He says, when we look at settler colonialism, it was basically defined by the idea of eliminating native indigenous people. Now, the idea of elimination doesn't necessarily mean genocide. It can, but it doesn't always imply genocide. The idea of settler colonialism was definitely inherent in a uniquely American idea known as manifest destiny. This was an idea that emerged in the United States in the 1840s, and it was this notion that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And inherent in that idea was that the Indian would be chased away. He would be eliminated from the landscape so that incoming white settlers could claim the land for farms, railroads. And this is a very famous lithograph that kind of gives a visual idea of manifest destiny. On the far left, we see American Indians hunting the buffalo in retreat before this wave of settlers and Conestoga wagons, the railroad, teams of oxen and plows, turning up the land. The idea of manifest destiny was really an idea of settler colonialism. Now, how did Americans eliminate the native from the land that would become, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota? Well, when we look at how this happened, it wasn't necessarily genocide. It was definitely removal, particularly from states on the east bank of the Mississippi, removal westward. And ultimately reservations, giving Indians usually very marginal lands that would keep them confined to a much smaller land base. Now, I like to point out that when we talk about settler colonialism, Nancy Shoemaker in particular has put that into, I think, a beautiful topology. She says that this settler colonialism was one type of colonialism, and it was predominant when we look at American history. But if we look at the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi before the United States came, you had the French from the 17th century to the 18th century. Then after that, for this relatively short interregnum, you had British control in the late 18th century up through the American Revolution and the early Republic. The French and the British weren't interested in settler colonialism. The French, for example, sent Jesuit missionaries. That's something that Shoemaker would call missionary colonialism. Both the French and the British were interested in the fur trade and extracting furs from the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi. This was another form of colonialism called extractive colonialism. And if we understand that, the French and the British never practiced settler colonialism in the Western Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi. That was unique to the American Republic. The French and the British had a very different set of aims. And again, the ideas of extractive and missionary colonialism are counterpoints to settler colonialism. And it's why the French and the British had a very different set of relationships. They also encountered Indian resistance, but it was of a qualitatively different nature. Now, there are a long series of historical works on the major leaders of Indian resistance movements in the United States. This is just a sample of them: Metacomet, Pontiac, Tecumseh, Wanatuchka, Osceola, Black Hawk, and the list goes on. I'm sure you've heard at least of a few of these Indian resistance leaders. Again, long before Patrick Wolfe really refined the idea of settler colonialism, there had already been many works on many of these leaders. Works on Black Hawk go back all the way to the 1830s. But I think the idea of settler colonialism puts all of these Indian resistance leaders into a much clearer context. They weren't just fighting white people. They were fighting white people who brought a certain ideology, what Americans called manifest destiny and what historians today are calling settler colonialism. And I think this is why settler colonialism is so useful. It allows us to, basically talk about an Indian resistance leader like Metacomet in New England, and an Indian resistance leader like Geronimo in the American Southwest, and an Indian resistance leader like Chief Joseph in the Rocky Mountains and the Plateau in the Northwest. It's allowing us to sort of look at Indian resistance as sort of in a much larger, much more continental context. And again, this can even, one of the things Wolfe figured out is that we can apply this also to, the history of Australia. And I think that's what we really want to do as historians. We want to look for these overall patterns, and we want to have conceptual tools that allow us to do that. So settler colonialism has been a big part of my research, and the notion of settler colonialism has really filtered into a lot of historical works, particularly in the last decade. I've definitely noticed in a lot more books that I'm reading now that that is the case. But another thing I wanted to bring into my article, the one that'll be published soon, is the idea of anonymous resistance. Now, this is something that is far less common in works of American history. There are two scholars who really developed this idea. Ranajit Guha, in his study of the Indian subcontinent and the resistance of South Asian Indians to British rule, and James C. Scott in his work on Southeast Asia. And what both of them basically say is that if you look at resistance to colonialism, there is a spectrum. It's not always violent. Sometimes it's nonviolent. Sometimes it involves not warfare, but far less violent activities such as rumor, theft, property destruction. Oftentimes, the perpetrators try to remain anonymous. unlike warfare, which is almost impossible to remain anonymous. Now, Gua and Scott, their work has influenced scholars in Europe, Latin America, East Asia, and the list goes on. But I found it kind of odd that virtually no American historians, at least none that I've been able to read, have really embraced their idea and tried to apply their idea of anonymous resistance. And one of my goals in writing this article for the Annals of Iowa is that this idea of anonymous resistance and many of the works that define it will find their way into works of American history. So just to give you a real quick working definition, anonymous resistance are those forms of resistance that are often nonviolent, not always, sometimes they can be violent, but the key thing is the perpetrators of anonymous resistance try to avoid getting caught. They want to show the colonial power that they don't extend legitimacy to their rule, but they want to do it in a careful way that doesn't expose them, make them vulnerable to punishment or anything else. And again, Scott and Gua both have written on this extensively for anti-colonial resistance in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But I have found their work largely absent in the study of Indian-white relations in North America. So let's kind of look at how that plays out. And again, this was something I noticed when I was in graduate school, that if you really dig deep into the archival sources, you see all sorts of examples of American Indians practicing anonymous forms of resistance to settler colonialism as practiced by the United States. So a little bit about the research itself. My focus has, for the last 30 years, been on the Western Great Lakes region and the Upper Mississippi. These are all the Indian nations who live there. It's important to understand that none of these Indian nations had tribal governance, not in the strictest definition of tribal government as an anthropologist would understand it. These were societies that were largely autonomous, that consisted of autonomous village societies. Of course, those autonomous villages cooperated with each other. But in order for like the entire Ho-Chunk nation to go to war, it largely would have required the consensus of large numbers of village leaders, warriors, war leaders of the entire Ho-Chunk nation. So these were largely societies of autonomous and semi-autonomous villages within the Great Lakes and the Upper Mississippi. Now, I like to point out that before the War of 1812, the United States had virtually no presence in this region. There were 2 small military posts, fewer than 200 soldiers for this entire region, everything that you see up on the map here. Not surprisingly, it fell very quickly to the Indians and to the British during the War of 1812 because the United States was very weak militarily, politically, legally, in every way. Now, after the War of 1812, the United States learns by its mistakes and it develops a far stronger military presence. So you can see that after 1815, the United States peppers this whole region with a whole series of military posts. But even then, all of these military posts by 1822 had about 1,200 men. And you can see that's a pretty big area. And for the most part, these were posts that kind of just controlled geopolitically, important areas like the Sioux St. Marie Rapids, the Green Bay, parts, places along the Mississippi. So these new posts, these military posts were enough to be a threat, but they were hardly enough to subdue the tribes. So this sketch here shows Fort Howard in the 1820s. I found this sketch on a document that when I was doing research at the National Archives many years ago. And it shows how small these forts were. They usually only had a few hundred men in them. So they were relatively small and very vulnerable. So we see some of the first anonymous forms of resistance immediately after the United States establishes this network of small garrisons throughout the region. Just using Fort Howard as an example. After 1816, when the fort was established, a party of local Indians, most likely Menominees, shot at a civilian employed by the garrison. Later, another party, most likely Menominees, shot at a soldier. Three other Indians, tribal affiliation unknown, but again, most likely Menominees, assaulted a soldier and stole his gun. Other Native people attacked oxen that belonged to the post. And you start to see in the archival records all these little incidents, not just at Fort Howard, but at all of these posts. Soldiers being assaulted, unknown Native people, taking shots at soldiers working outside the palisades, oxen being stolen. Just the list goes on. Things that most historians had just overlooked over time because they weren't violent. They were these small little acts of resistance. And it's important to understand the American Indians and their British allies believed that the post-war occupation of the region after the War of 1812 was illegal. They believed that the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, forbade the United States from having any military posts on Indian lands. So they believe, you have to look at it from the American Indian perspective. They see the United States Army as a foreign occupying force in their country. The British see it that way too, but the British had withdrawn from the region because they had bigger problems in Europe. So when we look at it from the Native perspective, this is a foreign occupation force in their country. So we can see why they would have practiced anonymous forms of resistance against the United States. And the American Indians see this, what they're doing, as a continuation of what they did during the War of 1812, fight the United States. And that's something else that I think has been missing in a lot of the scholarship on post-war of 1812 Indian resistance. This is in many ways a continuation of the War of 1812. Now, there were far more serious incidents than taking pot shots at soldiers. Just one example here. At Fort Armstrong in 1820, there were two Ho-Chunk people, Chuachara and his young nephew, Warajinka. They found two soldiers of Fort Armstrong working outside the fort, and they killed them and scalped them. And then they left, hoping they wouldn't get caught. Now, one thing I found out too is the United States had means to discover perpetrators of crimes like this. The commander at another fort, Prairie du Chien, took four Ho-Chunk people hostage and told the tribe, you turn over the people who killed these two soldiers, or we're going to kill these four Ho-Chunks who we have in our custody. And ultimately, the Ho-Chunks did turn over the two perpetrators of this crime. There was another incident at Fort Howard where a local Ojibwa warrior killed the post surgeon outside of a ways outside of Fort Howard. The Fort Armstrong killings were by far the most documented. But you start to see that some of these anonymous forms of resistance were everything from relatively nonviolent to sometimes outright killings. But again, Native people see this as a foreign occupying army. Another example, in 1824, there was an Ojibwa war party. They had gone west to fight the Dakotas, their enemies, but they came up empty. They ran across four Americans at Lake Pepin, which is an expansion of the Mississippi, up along the Minnesota-Wisconsin border. They killed the entire American party of traders. There was quite a bit of documentation on this. The United States coerced the Ojibwa to give up 6 of the perpetrators. There were 28 Ojibwas involved in the war party, but they turned over the 6 most guilty. And all 6 of the perpetrators managed to escape the jail on Mackinac Island. And ultimately, they remained anonymous. They were never recaptured again. But the Ojibwa were particularly anti-American. They had been staunch British allies during the War of 1812. So they didn't just see American soldiers as interlopers, as occupiers. They saw the American traders coming in the wake of the US Army as basically part of this foreign occupation of their country. Now, the next flashpoint was by far the most significant, and this would be in what we call the lead mining region. And if you look at the map on the left, I have it there. It was this triangle of land in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Dubuque on the other side of the river in what is today Iowa. After the War of 1812, thousands of American miners flooded into this region to mine lead. By 1826, there were probably 1,500 Americans. And the map at the right is a detail of just many of the small, what were called diggings, where you have Americans, mostly coming from Missouri, mining lead, because lead was quite valuable. And you can see on the far right of that map, many of these diggings were very close to Ho-Chunk villages. This is like a third wave of American invaders coming into Indian lands, the army, fur traders, and now thousands of lead miners. Now, it would be this incursion of lead miners into the lead mining region, and this would also include, again, Dubuque on the Iowa side of the border, that irritated the American Indians who lived in the region. So in 1827, there would be a Ho-Chunk leader named Wanasuchka. In English, that would be Redbird. And he finally decided that he had had enough. He was tired of the constant indignities. Lead miners are often assaulted his people. They often sexually assaulted women. And of course, he saw them as illegal occupants of Ho-Chunk lands. Now, Wanasuchka would try to do the same thing he had his people did during the War of 1812. They had banded together into a pan-tribal confederation. They had they had the support of the British, and they had successfully engaged the United States in war. In 1827, he would try to foment a rebellion of the regional tribes. This would be called the Winnebago Uprising, Winnebago being the older name of the Ho-Chunk people, or as it's more commonly being called now, the Redbird Uprising. The Redbird Uprising really would not amount to very much. Ho-Chunk warriors under Redbird committed some killings at Prairie du Chien. They had assaulted some American keelboats on the Mississippi. They had attracted support from some of the Dakotas and several of the various Ho-Chunk bands. But ultimately, the United States managed to overwhelm the Ho-Chunk people, particularly those around the Rock Island, Prairie du Chien, Prairie La Crosse, and Fox, Wisconsin Portage, which I have up there. And the Redbird Uprising was put down pretty quickly. But what's important is it started as a series of anonymous forms of resistance against Americans. It culminated in this attack against American keelboats on the Mississippi. It was an instance where anonymous forms of resistance crossed the threshold into overt public forms of resistance, namely warfare. Now, one thing I noticed after this, and I was kind of proud of myself because no one had ever really figured this out before. I decided at one point, I said, I got to figure out all of the times when American Indians practice forms of resistance against the United States, but I'm only going to look at non-lethal forms of resistance. And I knew that the records were very incomplete. But even with incomplete records, I said, wow, you have definite recordings of various depredations, as the United States called them, from 1816 to 1826. But then after the Redbird Uprising, they spike. There's many more recorded instances. Now, I should note that American Indians practice resistance against the United States because, oftentimes they were the victims of white aggression themselves. And oftentimes it was tit for tat. We've been attacked by the Americans, miners in particular. We need to hit them back. But no doubt, I mean, you see this real spike in the number of instances of resistance after 1827. There were two reasons for it. First of all, after the Redbird Uprising, thousands of more miners came into the lead mining region. The other reason was that thousands of new settlers were going into northern Illinois, agricultural settlers. And the lead mining region was one center of Indian resistance. The other was to the south at a place called Saukenuk. This is the Quad Cities region today. That was the home of the Sauk Indians, and they were being overrun by white agricultural settlers from southern Illinois. And it would be this influx of white settlers into around Saukanook that led to the next major instance of resistance. You see on the map there, Saukanook on the left. The Sauks had quite a bit, several different issues with the United States government. To a lesser degree, their lands were being overrun by lead miners, but they also had been cheated out of much of their land in 1804 in a land cession treaty with the United States, and it was clearly a fraudulent treaty. But we see the same pattern. Indian resistance begins with these anonymous, non-lethal types of resistance, and then it ultimately culminates into more public, more overt, and ultimately violent forms of resistance. Now, that's going to be, of course, the Black Hawk War. Now, I don't think I'm not going to recount the whole Black Hawk War. I wrote a whole book about it back in 2007, and I'm sure there's libraries in Iowa that have it. But there are a couple things that are worth pointing out. Black Hawk was forced to cross the Mississippi in 1831. He decided to cross back to his homelands in 1832. He didn't plan to make war. He was going to try to do many of the same things that Redbird did, create a regional tribal alliance, but he wanted to peacefully coerce the United States into renegotiating the 1804 treaty. It was a public form of resistance, but it was a peaceful, non-lethal form. Now, it was preceded by many other forms of, both public and anonymous resistance before that. But ultimately, what's going to happen at a place called Stillman's Run, which you can see on the map to the right, a group of drunken Illinois militiamen ran into a small war party of Black Hawk's warriors. And what was supposed to start was supposed to be an instance of peaceful resistance turned into violent resistance. And the incident at Stillman's Run precipitated the Black Hawk War. But even during the Black Hawk War, we see elements and instances of anonymous forms of resistance. Some of them quite lethal, some of them non-lethal. One of my favorite examples is the Potawatomi Creek Massacre of 1832. Black Hawk attracted some of the tribes to his standard, particularly after violence erupted and he was forced to fight by the United States. But we see many instances of tribes rising up against local white settlers, basically settling scores with white settlers who they believed had wronged them. A good example is the Potawatomi Creek Massacre in Illinois. A group of Potawatomis who had been attacked by local white settlers during the Black Hawk War. They attacked a white settlement at Indian Creek. There were 23 settlers present when they attacked. They killed 15 of them and took 2 of them as prisoners. They basically used the Black Hawk War as a means to rise up against local settlers, to settle scores. But it was anonymous. And the perpetrators who committed the Potawatomi Creek Massacre or the Big Indian Creek Massacre were never apprehended. So the Black Hawk War gave cover to those American Indians like the Potawatomis who continued to voice grievances over local white settlers and this project of settler colonialism. Now, my article goes into Wisconsin and Illinois quite a bit more than it does Iowa. I do like to point out that the Meskwakis, who lived on the Iowa side of the Mississippi, participated in many of these instances of resistance that I just talked about. The Redbird Uprising to a very small extent, to the Black Hawk War, much more so, the War of 1812 to be sure. But one of the things, if we want to look at another instance in Iowa history, we see an almost identical pattern. Many of you have probably heard of the 1857 Spirit Lake Massacre. If we look at the basic structure of it, we see something almost identical to the Redbird Uprising and the Black Hawk War. The leader was Inkpaduta. He was a Dakota chief. And we see the same basic pattern. He and his people suffered numerous indignities and outrages by local white settlers in northwestern Iowa. It begins with a series of anonymous acts of resistance that don't make it immediately evident who's committing these acts of resistance against local white settlers. When local white settlers practice violence against the Dakotas, Inkpaduta and his people resort to open warfare, open lethal forms of resistance. And that would be, again, probably the most prominent part of the Spirit Lake massacre. So again, you start to see that there's this pattern to Indian resistance. It's oftentimes anonymous resistance, nonviolent, non-lethal resistance. Oftentimes it's much more violent, still anonymous. Sometimes it's violent and much more overt, much more public, much more noticeable, what we would call open warfare. Now, I'll finish this off by saying that there's another scholar who does very similar research to myself, and that is John Bowes. He has developed the idea of adaptive resistance. What did the Indians do after it's clear that anonymous and overt resistance are not going to save their homelands? Well, according to Bowes, they turned to adaptive resistance. They tried to resist removal west of the Mississippi, like the Ho-Chunk did, or they demand reservations on at least part of their former territory, such as the Menominees. And I see that Bowes' idea of adaptive resistance is very compatible with anonymous resistance, with overt resistance and warfare. It's the form of resistance that Indians resorted to when it was clear that warfare was not going to save their lands anymore. So that's really a summary of what's going to be, I think, well over a 30-page article once it's in print. And I do want to save time for questions. I know that might have been a little bit quick, but it kind of gives you the main ideas. So at this point, I am going to take questions. And I think it's Matthew who is going to be the person who will basically direct questions my way. So Matthew?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. We have time to answer some questions. We have some ready for you. But if you have a question and you haven't submitted it yet, please submit it through the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And let's get started. So our first question for you today, could removing or eliminating the Native people include the development of boarding schools for Native children?
Yeah, I think so. Again, when we talk about elimination, and again, obviously I had to just give a bare summary of Patrick Wolf's work. I mean, how do you eliminate the native? Again, genocide was not nearly as common as most people think. Removal and reservations usually did the trick with a lot less bloodshed. But once you've isolated American Indian people, how do you basically get rid of the native? And there was this saying back in the reservation era, save the Indian, save the man, kill the Indian. So yeah, I would definitely think that boarding schools were part of a much larger program of eliminating not just Native people, but Native ideas, Native culture, trying to basically force their acculturation into the wider, Anglo-American society, definitely.
So this is an interesting question we received. You spoke about looking for patterns in history. Is gentrification of inner city neighborhoods another form of settler colonialism?
Honestly, I'll give you a tentative maybe. That's about as much as I want to commit. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that settler colonialism has been applied to. It's one of the after us, Australia and North America. One of the bodies of scholarship where I've seen it applied probably the most is in an analysis of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. I think, before I would commit to saying, yes to the question, I would say it's probably something that would have to be, researched in quite a bit more detail. And I think, before, there would be a sort of a cavalier, rush to judgment. It would be something that would have to be carefully researched before, an answer could be given. So I'll give a tentative maybe, but I haven't read any scholarship that would, at this point, be a definite yes.
So our next question is, were anonymous forms of resistance more rogue or unplanned?
They were, I think most of them were probably, just opportunities that kind of came up. It's clear. I mean, one of the things like with Chewachara and Waradjinka, the two Ho-Chunks who killed the two soldiers at Fort Armstrong in 1820. Once they actually had those two Ho-Chunk men in custody, they extensively interviewed them. And I found the entire transcript of the interview in the William Clark papers in Topeka, Kansas. And it's clear that they hadn't planned on going to Rock Island, where Fort Armstrong was, with the intention to kill two soldiers. They happened to be on Rock Island. They happened to stumble across two soldiers in the distance who were gathering firewood. It was clear from the transcript of the deposition that neither man had any love for the Americans and saw them as foreign interlopers. So in most cases, I think these anonymous acts of resistance, whether they were lethal or non-lethal, were largely the products of opportunities that kind of popped up. And keep in mind, I mean, we're talking just, we're not talking about millions of white people. We're talking about thousands at very scattered locations. So I tend to think, just from the available archival documents, that in most cases, these were just targets of opportunity. And I do have to emphasize that in just about every case, they were retribution for what the Indians saw as crimes against their people by Anglo-American settlers.
This is kind of building on this past question, but were anonymous forms of resistance more beneficial overall than more overt forms of resistance?
Well, and this is, I get back to the work of both Gua and Michael Scott. Anonymous forms of resistance were not going to win back the Indians' homelands. I mean, and they knew that. Anonymous forms of resistance, first of all, I think gave a certain amount of psychological comfort. We've suffered at the hands of Anglo-American settlers. We're going to make them suffer. Let's face it, revenge feels good a lot of times. But where it was really important is anonymous forms of resistance often paved the way for public forms of resistance, particularly warfare. And warfare was the only means by which, the Americans were going to be pushed back out of the region. The only way that warfare was going to be effective is if the Indians could do the same thing they had done during the War of 1812. And I go into this extensively in the article. They had to, band together in pan-tribal federations like they did during the War of 1812, and they had to somehow attract the support of the British in Canada. So there was definitely an ideology of resistance that existed among American Indians, but anonymous resistance paved the way for those more overt, violent forms of resistance like warfare that actually had a hope of being effective.
I'm going to combine two questions together for this one. But are you aware of instances of the Iowa participating in anonymous resistance? And to attach to that, is there any evidence that women were involved in the resistance as well?
As far as the Iowa, yeah, there were during the Black Hawk War at least a few instances of kind of on a smaller scale, but similar to the Big Indian Creek Massacre. But the Iowa were, quite a ways from the main theater of the Black Hawk War. As far as the Iowa, one thing I should probably talk a little bit more about the research I did. I really dug into the archival sources for the Western Great Lakes and for the Upper Mississippi Valley. There were Indian agencies at places like Rock Island, at Prairie du Chien, Portage, Green Bay, Chicago, and Indian agents would send their letters back to Washington to the War Department. The National Archives has all those letters by agency. They've all been, organized onto reels and microfilm. So, I looked at over 30 reels of microfilm. This took a long time to go through all the archival sources. The Iowa were represented, I forget by which agency, but I never looked at those archival records. I sort of had to circumscribe boundaries somewhere if I ever wanted to get a dissertation done and move on to full-time employment. I have no doubt if someone were really to dig into the archival records in the National Archives that were germane to the Iowa, that they would find a lot of similar instances. It's just that, again, given constraints, I wasn't able to look at the archival records for the Iowa people.
And actually tying into that, one of our questions is about your research. So what was your favorite research source and why, and where are you finding your resources?
Absolutely, no doubt. Letters received by the Office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Microfilm publication M234, record group 75, records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Those were by far the richest sources. Most of them have never been really looked at. Again, I looked at over 30 reels of microfilm from over a dozen different Indian agents over the course of basically 25 years. And again, it was thousands of documents. It was 30 reels of microfilm. But again, a lot of it was just untouched by previous scholars. And again, these small acts of resistance just pop up over and over. I would encourage anyone who wants to do similar research, you absolutely need to look at the letters received by the Office of Indian Affairs. Microfilm publication M234, absolutely the richest trove of documents that would record these instances of anonymous resistance.
Our next question, would you feel that Native people being forced from Eastern lands to the Midwest were also settlers of sorts, causing the same reactions between nations?
Yes, definitely. To some degree, the Oneida, for example, and two other tribes, the Stockbridge Munsee and the Brotherton, all of them somewhat voluntarily came to Wisconsin in the 1820s. The plan in the 1820s, at least among some people like John C. Calhoun in the War Department, they wanted to turn Wisconsin into something like a Western Indian reservation for Eastern tribes. And they wanted to basically force all the tribes, the Iroquois, many of the New England tribes, to move to Wisconsin as one of the first instances of Indian removal. The plan never really fully came to fruition. That's one of the things I want to research more for the future. But definitely the Oneida came, and they immediately got into conflicts with the Menominees over how much land and what land belonged to the Oneida and what belonged to the Menominees. But ultimately, the differences between them were settled without bloodshed. You have to understand that the tribes that were that coming from in the 1820s, the Oneida were Christian. They had been farmers for centuries. They were in many ways a very different, culturally different group of Native people than the Menominees and some of the tribes that lived in the Western Great Lakes.
So continuing that, is there a time when early resistant measures did not lead to war?
Well, yeah, I would say the Redbird Uprising of 1827. It led to a couple isolated and somewhat sensational instances of violence, but Redbird never really accomplished what he wanted. He hoped that these small acts of resistance and then this public instance of violence against these American keelboats, he hoped that it would just kind of rise up. Now, one thing I make very clear in the article, it would be wrong to think that every American Indian bought into this idea of resisting the United States. Many American Indians said this is foolish. We are not going to turn back white settlement. We have to somehow accommodate ourselves to this new order that the United States is bringing. So this was not some sort of, unanimous set of ideas. These were factions within various tribes that advocated various forms of resistance. There were also factions that basically advocated accommodation. The Sac are a good example. Black Hawk, advocated resistance. His counterpart, Keokuk, advocated accommodation. And Keokuk attracted 5 times more Sacs to his standard than Black Hawk did to his. So keep that in mind. I mean, this was, basically groups of Indians within the various tribal and villages communities who bought into the idea of resistance, and not all of them did. Many of them thought that accommodation was safer and better in the long run.
Our next question, when did Native resistance begin to decrease? Does it continue to this day?
Okay, well, one of the things I make clear in my article, it's clear that after the Redbird Uprising, there was a renewed, the United States comes in with a much stronger post-rebellion military contingent. After the Redbird Uprising, various non-lethal forms of resistance increased, but lethal resistance is gone. American Indians in the region said, these isolated murders, they're not going to do us any good, and we risk imprisonment if we don't get away with it. So there was this kind of odd decrease in lethal resistance after the Redbird Uprising, but a dramatic increase in non-lethal forms of resistance. But after the Black Hawk War, basically all public acts of resistance ended. There were thousands of new settlers in Iowa, in Illinois, in Wisconsin. And again, the Black Hawk War is a seminal event for Iowa. This begins the flood of white settlement. And American Indians, they were rational. They could look at these, these incoming white settlers and saying they outnumber us, significantly. If we rise up against them, we are just committing suicide. And it's clear after the Black Hawk War, and I agree with John Bowes 100%, what had been anonymous forms of resistance and these overt forms of resistance like warfare ends. And American Indians immediately moved to this new form of resistance called adaptive resistance. Try to resist removal westward, try to get a land reservation. They could see the demographics were against them. And violent resistance generally ceases after the Black Hawk War.
Our next question transitions into research again, but can you talk about your research among the descendants of the Native groups that you addressed?
The descendants, I'll be quite honest. I mean, I wrote a book on the Black Hawk War that was published in 2007. What I was really interested in was, did Black Hawk had this certain faction of the Sacs around him. There had actually been quite a bit of research done on this continual factual division among the Sacs. Even into the 20th century, even well after Black Hawk had died, there had been this very staunch traditionalist faction within the Sac, among the Sac people, that basically went all the way back to Black Hawk. And even after the tribe had moved to Oklahoma, even into the early 20th century, that faction that had originally coalesced around Black Hawk continued to exist. So talking about the descendants of the Sacs, I was really interested in seeing if Black Hawk had any lasting influence among the Sac people, and he definitely did. And that traditionalist, very sort of staunchly Sac faction that he had led during the Black Hawk War existed for well over a century after his death.
Actually, let's continue on this conversation. Our next question is, who do you believe is the most notable American Indian resistor, and what made this person stand out to you?
Okay, well, this is going to be just a pure bias, Tecumseh. Who led probably one of the most successful resistance movements during the War of 1812. Black Hawk and Redbird both saw themselves as latter-day Tecumsehs. Tecumseh created a true pan-Indian federation before the War of 1812. He was very savvy in making an alliance with the British, and I think it's safe to say the British depended more on Tecumseh than Tecumseh depended upon the British. Even the British were just impressed with his leadership, his wisdom. He was really, he was a leader's leader without any doubt. And so many Indian leaders after him modeled themselves upon Tecumseh. Absolutely, without a doubt, Tecumseh was the greatest Indian resistance leader in American history, although other American historians may dispute that and believe that other Indian resistance leaders like Sitting Bull or Geronimo were more important, but I think it was Tecumseh.
Perfect. And this is our last question to keep us on time today.
Sure.
But can you speak more about the Native Nations Leadership Organization? We're most working as anonymous village coalitions even into the 1820s, and did this affect treaties and resistance patterns?
Oh yeah, okay. As far as the way American Indian, socio-political structure was, again, when we look at a snapshot in time, say 1825, there's probably 40 Ho-Chunk villages, each of which has its own chief, and there was actually a system of dual chieftainship in each Ho-Chunk village. There was a Thunder Clan chief and there was a Bear Clan chief. There was someone who was sort of like an honorific chief of the Ho-Chunk, but he didn't have any real power. If Ho-Chunk villages wanted to have, if the Ho-Chunk nation wanted to make a decision that would be binding upon all Ho-Chunk people, all of those autonomous villages and all of the leaders of those autonomous villages would have to basically agree by consensus to a common course of action. And the same could be said about the Potawatomis, the Ojibwa. These were village societies and they could cooperate, but it was basically, for an entire Indian nation to come up with a common policy, that really required the cooperation of all the village leaders. And sometimes they could do it, but just as often as not, again, there would be accommodationist leaders like Keokuk, there would be resistance leaders like Black Hawk. And just as often as not, the United States managed to get land cession treaties by basically dealing with one faction of a tribe, ignoring the other, but then making the decision binding on the entire tribe. Or a very common occurrence, the United States would appoint one of the more conciliatory chiefs as the chief of the whole tribe. They made Keokuk the chief of both the Sacs and the Meskwaki after the Black Hawk War, despite the fact that that was not a legitimate move in the eyes of either the Sauk or the Meskwaki people. And I think it was in the 1827 where they declared Chief Oshkosh the chief of all the Menominees. And it's just because, of course, it was easier to deal with one person who was willing to conciliate to be conciliatory than with 30 or 40 different village leaders. So the United States kind of, often forced leaders on American Indian tribes just to make it easier to get what it wanted. Most in that, of course, was land.
And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. And I just want to say it's been a very informative lunch. So thank you, Patrick.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to thank once again the State Historical Society of Iowa.
Of course, we're happy to have you.
Listening. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And thank you to everyone joining us today as well. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, please check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. But while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you all here again on Thursday, February 10th for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.